Hello and welcome to episode 48 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Basa, and I'm sitting here on our back deck in South Carolina drinking sweet tea and gradually, ever so gradually becoming a redneck. In fact, one major step I took towards becoming a redneck just today is I went down to the bank and took out a loan to buy a Jeep. Not one of those wimpy like SUV Jeeps either. It's like a Wrangler. And I'm out here on the back porch because my sweetheart's mama is visiting us, and she has moved into the studio as her bedroom. So I'm out here, and just to sort of try and prevent more 3-hour long Q&As, I'm doing this only like 9 days after the last Q&A instead of 2 weeks. And I took days off. I took 2 days off from work, partly so I could go and pee in a cup. Partly, it turned out, so I could buy a Jeep. And partly I'm just burning off holiday pay or PTO, paid time off, because it looks like I'm very probably going to be switching jobs to one that pays higher at a different sheet metal shop. And that's one reason why my sweetheart wanted a vehicle is this new shop is not a 5-minute drive away. It's more like a half an hour drive away. So she doesn't want to be stranded here in case the dog gets sick or something. Or she suddenly wants to rush out and buy mulch, that kind of thing. But without any further ado, I suppose I should start answering questions. And because this is sort of less than 2 weeks, it's down to a manageable number. It's still quite a few, but it's not going to be 3 hours this time. And so the first question is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, when seeing an open, dilapidated, vacant parking lot, abandoned building, or places that used to have a lot of activity and are now unoccupied and deserted, I feel a certain calm and even joy. I want to go and stand or sit in them. Does this seem weird to you? Well, it doesn't seem particularly weird. Maybe I can relate to that to some degree, like going to a fairgrounds when there's no fair going on. It's just like empty. But there's all this commotion and stuff going on there at other times of year, or especially when I was a kid, and to some degree now, you just get sort of a spooky feeling when you go into an abandoned house where people live there, but now it's just all dilapidated and run down. So I don't feel particular joy in going to such places, but there is kind of an intriguing feeling you can get, or I can get. But yeah, I'll just move on to the next question here. The next question is from Achala or Asala or Akala, A-C-A-L-A. I think it's Achala. And Achala says, as far as rebirth is concerned, being born as an animal is actually Buddhist teachings. I have heard from some Zen monks that rebirth as an animal is a Hindu thing and not Buddhist teachings. I personally don't agree with this. I think probably Hindus later took the teachings from the Buddha and then put them into their scriptures. If rebirth has nothing to do with animals, then the question arises, how do animals come into existence? What are the causes which led them to be born in the animal realm? Why aren't there just human beings if rebirth is only concerned with humans? So I personally do believe that akusala karma would lead to rebirth in the 3 lower realms, but I would like if you could expand your thoughts on it and probably also provide a good sutta on the matter. Thank you. Well, I was discussing being reborn as an animal in the previous Q&A, number 47, and yeah, there are suttas that definitely talk about it. In fact, the entire Jataka literature is full of stories of the Buddha and his chief disciples being animals. I mean, they're not animals in every. The Buddha wasn't an animal in every rebirth, but he was, the fish king and the frog king, and the wise rabbit that threw himself into a fire to offer his own meat to like a wandering beggar who was actually Saka, king of gods, who then rewarded this rabbit by drawing a rabbit on the moon, because in India it's the rabbit in the moon and not the man in the moon, which then resulted in the idea that the Buddha is the man in the moon. There's the sutta, I think I mentioned it in the previous Q&A also, about how hard it is to get out of the animal realm, just because you have much less opportunity for earning merit and just acquiring wisdom, like learning about Dhamma when you're an animal. There was the simile of the blind turtle, the blind sea turtle, and I won't repeat it because I did it in the last one, but he says here, Zen monks, some Zen monks say that rebirth as an animal is a Hindu thing and not Buddhist teachings, but then again, I'm pretty sure it's one of the koans in the Mumon Kan, or the Wumen Kwan. I think it's one of the first ones where some Zen master answers the question, is like an enlightened being subject to karma? And he said no. And because of him saying no, he was reborn as a fox back behind the monastery somewhere. And some other monk hears about this story, and he knows that the fox is this Zen master who gave the wrong answer. And he goes back, and if I remember the koan correctly, I haven't read this in a while, he sort of preaches to the fox somehow that the arahant, or the fully enlightened being, is at one with the law of karma, which is the more correct answer. And then the fox died and was liberated from the animal realm. So it's been a teaching of Buddhism, if not the Buddha's authentic teachings. At least it has been taught in Buddhism since ancient times, because there's all kinds of mention of the Buddha being, in a previous life, animals, of people being reborn as animals. There's mention of it in Zen stories. So yeah, even some of the Jatakas are found in the like in the Vinaya. There's the story about how the Buddha in a previous life was a wise quail, if I remember correctly. So yeah, it goes back. It could be that the Buddhists and the Hindus, or the Buddhists and the proto-Hindus, got it from like an earlier source. Just like the traditional Shramanic tradition of that went back to the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization. Like some of the early Upanishads are also talking about a sort of reincarnational evolution, where you're starting off as something very simple, maybe a plant, maybe even less than a plant, like a crystal or something, and then you go up through the animal realm and insects and so forth, and you just keep going that way. And it does, I mean, the main issue for me, I can accept the idea that animals have rebirth, and that there is a kind of evolution via rebirth. But like I was mentioning in the previous video, for a human to go back to being an insect, I really don't see how there would be enough similarity in the mind of a human and the mind of an insect for a human with all of his complexity. Kind of crude compared to a deva maybe, but still, compared to an insect, we are just vastly, orders of magnitude beyond an insect in like mental complexity and mental force. So I don't think it would all fit into a mosquito. So I have read a strange theory in a book called Seth Speaks, where like a part of your karmic stream can break off and you've got this little spark of your karmic stream splitting off and becoming an animal, something like that. But yeah, I have no doubt that it has been taught in Buddhism since very early times, even if the Buddha himself didn't talk about it. the texts have the Buddha talking about it. And it's back as far as some of the earlier Upanishads in Hinduism or Brahmanism, Vedism. So here's one question, sub question here. What are the causes which led them to be born in the animal realm? It's just having an animalistic mind, especially at the moment of death. You know, if you're just completely controlled by lust or something like that, you know, some sort of animalistic greed, you know, hunger for food, you're just obsessed with food or something, then according to traditional Orthodox Buddhism, that having like animalistic urges to an extreme degree will have you be reborn as an animal. It's like if you die with the mind of an angel, you get reborn as an angel. You die with the mind of an animal, you get reborn as an animal. You die with the mind of a denizen of hell, you get reborn as a denizen of hell, so to speak. So that's kind of how it works, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Achala. In the Mahayana worldview, there is a common understanding. Nibbana and Samsara are the same thing, which is based on Nagarjuna's words. From a Theravada view, it doesn't make sense, since Nibbana doesn't lie in the realm of Samsara. It is the unconditioned, while Samsara is the conditioned existence. What is your view on it? Thank you. I'm really not 100% sure that it is based on Nagarjuna. I think Nagarjuna pretty much could have agreed with it to the extent that he would have asserted anything. I mean, Nagarjuna's philosophy just like attacks all assertions, and then after it destroys all other assertions, it just like turns the knife on itself and commits ritual suicide, and you wind up with no assertions whatsoever. It could have gone back to like Pragya Paramita or Prajna Paramita. That was like an early movement in Mahayana Buddhism, which would include like the Diamond Cutter and the Heart Sutra and that sort of thing. It could go back to that, which I think is earlier than Nagarjuna, but I'm no authority on the subject. But really, I've talked about this before. The whole idea that Nibbana and Samsara are the same, to an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist, most Orthodox Theravada Buddhists would just snort with derision at the very idea that they're like opposites. But I can accept that Nibbana and Samsara, I mean, you can look at it as essence and form. Like, I've talked about this before, you know, like the gold ring. You know, the essence is gold, and ring is the form of it. And Samsara is the world of forms. I mean, even the so-called formless realm there's still some kind of mental form there, even if it's not physical. So you can see Nibbana as just the essence of ultimate reality, and Samsara are like the mirages or illusions, or just the superficial, semi-real conditional forms that are conditionally co-arising in accordance with Paticca Samuppada or dependent co-arising. Or there was one person on the Discord server where this question was asked who said that Nibbana is, you know, the universe as seen through enlightened eyes, and Samsara is the very same universe as seen through unenlightened eyes, which is another sensible way of explaining it. So, I mean, if you have perfect eyes, you see everything as perfect, so to speak. That's not Orthodox Theravada, though. So I'm deviating from orthodoxy by answering this question, because if I were strictly Orthodox, I would just snort in derision at the very idea that Nibbana and Samsara are the same. Because, you know, going with like Abhidhamma, for example, they obviously are not the same. They're just qualitatively different. Because Nibbana is one ultimate reality, and all the rest of the ultimate realities, and there's lots of them, are all aspects of Samsara. So, yeah, I mean, either of the two earlier explanations I gave, that Nibbana is just the ultimately real essence, which transcends the duality even of existence and non-existence, so it's paradoxical, and samsara is just the form, the outward, apparent forms of like an imperfect mind or an unenlightened mind trying to make sense of reality. But sense itself is samsara. So I guess I answered that one. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Crazy Librarian. And Crazy Librarian says, do Hindus have history of taking some inspiration from Buddhism and put it in their scriptures? I thought they are older. Well, Hinduism itself, I mean, in the Buddhist time, it wasn't really Hinduism yet. It was hardly even proto-Hinduism. It was just sort of Vedic Brahmanism. That Hinduism, if you trace its evolution, it goes back to the proto-Indo-European, like, paganism or polytheism that was not particularly mystical, not particularly metaphysical, that it was mainly sacrificing to the gods for worldly benefits, like sons, cattle, and victory in battle. And then gradually, as it came into India, the parts of the Rig Veda were supposedly composed before the Indo-Aryans even made it into India. Their worship of like the Vedic gods predated their entry into India, their invasion or settlement or whatever. And then they came in contact with a very strange spiritual culture based on the Indus Valley civilization, I'm pretty sure. It was like the Shramanic tradition. And they started absorbing a lot of ideas from this earlier tradition just through osmosis, just, cultural interaction, I suppose. So, around the Buddhist time, a little bit before the Buddhist time, they started up with the Upanishads. They started composing Upanishads, which is like the Vedanta, which literally means the end of the Vedas. It's the last part of the Vedas, presumably the culmination of the Vedas with regard to wisdom and profundity. And then after that, it was non-Vedic scriptures started, like Puranas and like the Bhagavad Gita, which is now considered to be one of the main Hindu scriptures, which technically isn't even canonical scripture because it's not in the Vedas. So as this Vedic Brahmanism sort of moved southwards into southern India, it became more and more devotional, more and more emphasis on certain gods rather than some of the Vedic gods. Like the two main Vedic gods were Indra and Agni, and they've pretty much faded out. It's mainly the two main gods in India nowadays among the Hindus are Vishnu and Shiva. I think most Hindus in India would be either Vaishnavites or Shaivites. But yeah, there was a lot of interaction between Buddhism and this Vedic into Hindu stream, this continuum, I guess you can call it. I mean, you can't really call it Hinduism back in the Buddhist time, proto-Hinduism or whatever. So, yeah, it was like Shankara, who wrote some of the most important commentary on the Upanishads, and is considered to be one of the founding fathers of Advaita Vedanta. He supposedly got a lot of his ideas from Madhyamaka Buddhism, which is a kind of Mahayana Buddhism. Also, the Hindu emphasis on non-killing or ahimsa. Why Hindus tend to be vegetarian, or they don't even kill insects. Supposedly, apparently that was also from Buddhist influence. But Buddhism also got a lot of influence from Proto-Hinduism, especially with a lot of the terminology. The idea of karma and the Brahman, and just most of the Buddhist terminology is derived from Sanskrit, Sanskrit philosophical terminology. Maybe not all of it, but most of it. So there was a lot of back and forth, and that was a good thing, I think. There was a lot of relatively peaceful debate going on between different philosophical schools, within Buddhism, within the Vedic traditions, and also other traditions, the Jains, the Jivakas, other sects, and they were not only debating, among themselves, but like with the different sects, and it strengthened each school. The ones that survived, they endured the purifying fire of everyone pitching shit at them, essentially, just like finding fault with their arguments. Because I mean, if you're debating with other people, you have to have a relatively strong foundation. You have to have a point of view that can stand up to scrutiny and like critical attack. And I used to always consider that. What's the point of having a point of view that really cannot stand up to scrutiny and criticism? I mean, if you have to protect your point of view, like I think Christianity really went this other route where it's just like just shut down all debate, shut down all dissension, all deviation from orthodoxy, because it makes them feel really uncomfortable when people are just like poking holes in their theology or whatever. So it was in India, there was a lot of this debate and like honing their positions, that it really strengthened the spiritual tradition in India, I think. And it really is praiseworthy that for the most part they got along. Like Nalanda University, it was all these different schools of Buddhism. They did their ceremonies separately. They had different ecclesiastical boundaries for the different schools, but still they'd come together and study together and debate relatively non-violently. It didn't devolve into brawls or anything like that. So yeah, it went both ways. I think mostly with regard to philosophy, it was Mahayana Buddhism and Hinduism that were influencing each other a lot. Although, like I said, it was even early Buddhism, like the Buddha himself is largely responsible for Hindus adopting ahimsa and stopping doing animal sacrifices and just starting to pour melted butter and honey and incense and things onto the fire for their sacrifices. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Hey It's Tig. And Hey It's Tig says, I've read that yogis are forbidden from eating garlic and onions. Does the Vinaya Pitaka also prohibit monks from consuming these and related foods? Well, onions are okay for a monk, but there is a rule against monks eating raw garlic unless they are sick. And I guess the origin story, which I haven't read in many years, but if I remember correctly, there was a congregation of monks listening to the Buddha's sermon, and one of the monks had eaten raw garlic and was kind of grossing out the people around him that were smelling his breath. And so the Buddha, right then and there, made a rule that monks are not allowed to eat raw garlic unless they are sick. So, but that's as far as it goes. Onions is no problem. Although I have read there was a Chinese pilgrim. He was a Buddhist, like during the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, who traveled to India looking for as yet untranslated scriptures that had not yet been translated from Indian languages into Chinese. And he said that the people of northern India were devout Mahayana Buddhists who did not eat meat or garlic or onions. So at some point, Buddhists, especially Mahayana Buddhists, stop eating meat, garlic, and onions, although a Theravada Buddhist is allowed to eat all of them if the garlic is cooked, or if he is sick, he can eat raw garlic. Let's see here. I want to do justice to this garlic question. I read that yogis are forbidden from eating garlic and onions. Yeah, later ideas about how garlic and onions are like the three guna idea of different foods. You've got sattvic foods, which are conducive to wisdom, like grains, dairy products, nuts, fruits, and then you've got rajasic foods that cause passion, like meat and spicy food, and then you've got tamasic food, which tend towards like inertia, lethargy, just sort of semi-consciousness. And I'm not sure where garlic and onions would be. They'd be one of the two lesser ones. They're not sattvic foods. I think mushrooms are considered to be the classic tamasic, darkness-inducing food. So, yeah, I don't think that that was really a factor in early Buddhism. Just the idea of this food, produces this kind of energy that is bad for your spirit or something. That hadn't evolved yet in Indian philosophy. It's mentioned a lot in the Bhagavad Gita because it was sort of a pre-Buddhist, pre-Hindu school of philosophy called Sankhya that had the three gunas. And then they were kind of working out this theory, and it got adopted um, into Hinduism as yoga. And there's a lot of it represented in the Bhagavad Gita also. But I think I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Stevie. And Stevie says, how does alms round actually work? Can you please walk us through every step from the time you leave until the time you've cleaned your bowl? Is there a standard time villages are supposed to look for monks? If not, how do they know what time to look for you? Thank you. Well, with regard to this last part first, is there a standard time? It's definitely morning. Monks are only allowed to eat between dawn and midday, so it would definitely be in the morning. And my experience in Burma, and also to some degree in Thailand, is that there's just like a standard time for monks to go for alms in different areas. Like in the cities, it might be a little later. Out in the villages where you've got subsistence farmers that get up at the crack of dawn, it might be just right after dawn when people are up and cooking their food. But generally, monks go around the time that people are cooking breakfast, which may be anywhere between like dawn and maybe like 9 in the morning. Although there are some monasteries and just monks in some areas will eat 2 meals a day. They might have the early meal, the so-called dawn meal, just delivered to the monastery, and then they might go later, like 10:30, something like that. So usually it's just like a standardized time locally. In this village, the monks go at a certain time, or in Rangoon or whatever. So yeah, but it's always sometime in the morning. And let's see, the time you leave, yeah, well, I mean, when a monk enters the village, he's got to have both shoulders covered, and usually it's wrapped in a certain way. And I used to try and go for alms just completely according to the book, and almost nobody does this anymore. For example, in the Buddhist time, there were no bowl lids. Nowadays, almost all monks will have this lid to their bowl, and then if people offer them something that doesn't mix good, like a package of cookies or something, a lot of times they'll just put it on top of the bowl. Sometimes monks in Burma will have like little curry cups on top of the bowl lid, and then people want to offer curry, some kind of sauce or something goopy. They'll put it into little cups so it doesn't all get mixed together in the glop. But they didn't have bowl lids in the Buddhist time. There's no mention of them in Vinaya. And so the way a monk was supposed to go for alms, he'd go into the village, both shoulders covered. If his bowl was in a bag, he has to take it out of the bag before he enters the village. And then he holds the bowl under his robe. And anyone who has seen like old videos of me as a monk in Burma, I mean, I look like I'm 9 months pregnant because I'm holding my bowl underneath my robe. That's like the bowl lid. And you have to be careful not to get goop on the inside of your robe, because if the bowl gets filled too full, then it's easy to get glop on your robe. And then what a monk is supposed to do, I mean, he walks to the village. He's got to have both shoulders covered before he enters the village. He's got the bowl taken out of any bag that it was in, and then he's holding the bowl with both hands. He's got to look downwards. I mean, just like 6 feet in front of him, eyes downcast, and he walks quietly through the village. And if he gets to a house, he stops for a few seconds. And then according to the rules of monastic discipline, they've got instructions on this. It says, the monk stops for a little while, but if she stands up from her work, or she starts wiping off a spoon, or she starts wiping off a bowl, then that's a pretty good indication that she's getting ready to offer something. And so the monk is allowed to stand a little bit longer. In the past, as well as nowadays, it's usually women who offer food to monks. So that's why it says if she does this or if she does that, because it's usually women who are offering food. Um, so then what he's supposed to do, and almost nobody does this anymore because now they have bowl lids and all that. But what he's supposed to do is he's supposed to lift up his robe to get the bowl out with one hand. Then he holds out the bowl. I think he's supposed to use his right hand. I was left-handed, so with regard to alms round anyway. So I kind of did it the opposite. But you're supposed to lift up the robe with your left hand, hold out the bowl with your right hand until it's free of the robe. Then you hold the bowl with both hands and respectfully just keep your eyes on the food when people are putting the food in. And you're not supposed to make any faces. You're not supposed to turn down anything unless it's obviously, not allowable. If they try to offer you money or something, a monk's not supposed to allow that. Some wise guy's going to put like dog crap in your bowl. I mean, you have to accept that. But I mean, I've accepted some pretty gross stuff, and I mean, you're not allowed to say anything. I mean, you just have to keep a poker face. You just accept it respectfully. It could be like some little old lady whose eyesight isn't good anymore. This happened to me a lot. She put a piece of cake into my bowl that was just swarming with ants. There's little ants all over it. She can't see the ants because she doesn't have glasses. Her eyesight isn't good anymore. I've had rotten food put into my bowl with like maggots in it. And I mean, you just accept it. You don't know what it's fried bugs, little frogs or something. You just, or sometimes, you got a nice piece of cake sitting over on one side of the bowl, and then some lady will come and just pour soup all over it. And you're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to do anything. Or like, and this happened more than once. You've got like some woman just blows her nose into her hand and just kind of flings the snot off and then offers food with the same hand. Or you've got some little kid who's just coughing. He's just coughing and sneezing or whatever right into the food. No concept of hygiene. And then puts the food into your bowl. You have to accept all of it. Someone with leprosy offers you food. You just accept it. In fact, there's a famous story. I think it's Kassapa's verses in the Theragatha, where he's talking about how he was going for alms, and a leper, a beggar with leprosy, saw him, and he looked so majestic that this leper was inspired to offer him some of his own food. So he goes up kind of humbly and timidly and wants to offer food into Mahakassapa's bowl. Mahakassapa, fully enlightened, also he's the great disciple who was the most strict with regard to ascetic practice. He calmly accepts. And the leper, when he's putting a handful of food from his own bowl into Mahakassapa's bowl, one of his fingertips breaks off and lands in the bowl. And Mahakassapa does not raise an eyebrow. And, he just continues on his way. And the beggar with leprosy is following along to see what Mahakassapa is going to do, because he's mortified at this. And Mahakassapa, when he gets enough food, he just sits down. He doesn't even take the fingertip out of the bowl. He just moves it over to one side and just eats his meal. And that story, or those verses, were it was recommended reading. One of my teachers advised me to read that and take it to heart, when I go for alms, because that's like a role model. So anyway, when you got enough food, you just go back out of the village and sit down wherever is convenient for you to sit down. I mean, there's dining halls in a lot of monasteries. I would just sit in front of my cave and sit in my hut or whatever. Generally, you don't want to eat inside your hut because there's so many ants in the tropics that you drop one crumb and there's going to be a whole legion of them looking for a second crumb. And then after you eat, you've got any leftovers, you feed the scroungy dog that's hanging out, or you go and feed the crows and the squirrels and the wild chickens or whatever, and wash your bowl. Generally got a big clay water pot just for washing bowls and so forth, and that's pretty much it. I mean, the way it's done nowadays isn't necessarily the way it was done in the Buddhist time, and it's not the way that is recommended in the text. Like, I suppose even in the Buddhist time, there may have been long lines of monks going for alms together. I usually went by myself, but long lines of monks just silently walking through the villages or through the city, their eyes downcast, and people just standing there waiting to offer food. I really couldn't do house by house alms round in certain places because I would start getting too famous, and you just get right to the outskirts of the village and there'd be this line of 40, 50, sometimes over 100 people wanting to offer food. So I couldn't really go house by house alms round. I mean, I could have insisted upon it and been kind of a dick, but I just figured, well, this is making sure everyone who wants to offer food is here, because sometimes you go house by house, you got somebody eagerly waiting to offer you food halfway through the village, your bowl fills up before you get that far, you just have to turn around and come back, and then they don't get to offer anything. So I guess that's how, I mean, I think I've answered this question. There might be something important that I'm leaving out, but that is how alms round works. It's just every morning, if a monk wants to eat something, I mean, traditionally, he, has to cover both shoulders, takes his alms bowl, walks through the village. Anyone who wants to offer food can offer the food. When he gets enough, he leaves and sits down and eats it. And there is a verse in the Dhammapada saying that a monk going for alms is like a bee going from flower to flower. The bee just takes a little bit from each flower and doesn't cause any harm or hardship to any of the flowers. And that's the way it's supposed to be. It might be, especially if you've got a long line of 100 people, each person just gets to put in 1 spoon of rice, maybe 1 spoon of curry. And of course you're going to have like the wise guys who are like trying to cheat and like balance a banana on the spoon, or they bring some huge serving spoon from home or something. So yeah, it was nice. I really liked going for alms round, especially at first. I was very grateful. The first time I went for alms round was in Bangkok. I mean, a real alms round. They had sort of like a art imitation alms round at the monastery in California where I was ordained, where they'd ring the bell at like 10:30 or so, and the monks would file past the kitchen building and people would offer food. But it wasn't exactly the same as just going out into this town or village and having total strangers offering food to you. And I really liked that. It was nice. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Hiram Cathul. I don't know how to pronounce this name. And HRYMKTHUL says, do you plan to publish your father's autobiography? If so, when? I would love to read it. Yeah, there was a recent blog post on my blog that included chapter 1 of my father's spiritual autobiography. And it's one of the only things that I inherited from my father, or one of the only material things that I inherited from my father after he died was his writings. And I took about half of it, the best half, and typed it into the computer, which I still have. The other half was in a box. I went to Burma. It was stored at a monastery in California. When I come back to that monastery a few years later, the building that the box was in is gone. The box is gone. Nobody knows where it is. So about half of what my father wrote that I got just disappeared. Just through, I don't know, carelessness or something. I'm not sure. But the thing is, my father's spiritual autobiography was like written on like stenographer's tablets, just steno pads, and I had to transcribe it into the computer in digital form, and apparently one of the steno pads was missing, and so I would have to write that chapter, filling in the gaps, which fortunately was during my lifetime when I was a kid. So I can remember a lot of the stuff that my father would have written. Like there was an Uncle Henry. It was a freed slave owned by, well, before he was freed, he was owned by one of my great grandfathers, I think. And then after he was freed, he just stayed and they lived together, and they were like best friends. But when I was a kid, presumably, the story goes that Uncle Henry was like haunting our house, and my little brother, who was like maybe 5 years old at the time, could see him. I couldn't see him. My father couldn't see him, my little brother would be talking about this black man who was in the house. And during the daytime, if he saw him, he said, "Don't sit there." The man is sitting there. He just called it, his man or the man. But if he saw him at night, he'd get really scared. So my father was going to seances at that time. He trained spirit mediums, and Uncle Henry would come through sometimes, and he asked Uncle Henry if he was hanging around the house. Uncle Henry said yes, and he asked him, please, just don't scare the kid. So it kind of fixed the problem, I think. But as I'm saying, I would have to not only edit this, but I would have to supply a missing chapter in order to publish my father's spiritual or occult autobiography. It's well worth reading. He lived an interesting life. But I've got enough material for probably 3 books at least, and I just lack the time and energy as a householder who has to work full time to edit books. I edited 3 during the months between me dropping out of the monkhood and starting work at a sheet metal shop. But now that I'm working at a sheet metal shop, I'd have to take at least a week off and just dedicate that time not to hanging out with my sweetheart or going on vacation or anything, but just locking myself in a room and editing. And there's a good chance it's going to happen sooner or later, but I don't know when. So I'll just move on to the next question here. I specialize in long answers to short questions. And this question is from Jeremy. And Jeremy says, "Are you familiar with Bhikkhu Sujato and his site Sutta Central? What do you think of his translations?" I'm really not familiar with Bhikkhu Sujato and his site Sutta Central. He apparently has some familiarity with me because I've been told that any mention of me or of my Atthakavagga translation is deleted from his website because he's a far leftist apparently, and he considers me to be a Nazi. And so, I'm just banned from his website from the forum part of it, and any mention of me gets deleted, or so I've been told. I've looked I've given it a few cursory glances, but I don't remember reading any of his translations or anything like that, so I can't really comment other than what I've already commented. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, "You mentioned walking and sitting meditation, but what about standing and lying meditation?" And then in parentheses, you got lion's posture. Well, lying meditation doesn't work very good. There are some people who can do it, but as a general rule, if you lie down and try to meditate, you get sleepy. It's like your mind has associated lying down with just being relaxed and sleepy. And so it's really easy to just fall asleep if you're trying to meditate in a prone or just recumbent horizontal position. With regard to standing meditation, there was one Burmese Sayadaw, Tanjidong Sayadaw, who specialized in standing meditation. And one problem with standing meditation is, you get into sort of an altered mental state, you can fall down easy. And every once in a while at the retreat, I went to a Tanjidong meditation retreat, and every once in a while you just hear this thump where someone just falls over. But one thing about sitting or standing meditation is after 20 minutes or so, the soles of your feet are just on fire. You're standing motionless, sort of like sitting motionless. Gradually you get uncomfortable, and mainly from the standing posture, it's just the soles of your feet just get hot and start burning. And then all of the advantages that Tanjidong Sayadaw gave for standing meditation were all health things. It wasn't anything spiritual. It was you'll never get a stroke in your life and this kind of a thing. So I think walking and sitting are the 2 best positions for meditation. I'm not sure if there's any symbolic value to it, but Venerable Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant, he was spending so much time attending to the Buddha that he didn't have enough time to practice diligently. And so at the time of the Buddha's death, he himself was not yet enlightened. But then it was getting close to the first council where the monks were going to get together, or the chief monks in the Sangha were going to get together and discuss what to do now that the Buddha is gone. And he was the only one, according to the story, which is canonical, that he was the only one who was not enlightened yet. And so he was just doing strenuous meditation, just sitting, walking, until finally one night, it may have even been the eve of the first great council, he just, I don't know if he actually gave up, but he was just getting so tired, he figured he better just lie down and go to sleep. And just as he was in the transition between sitting and lying down, he sits down on his cot or mat or whatever, and then he's in like this transitional sort of 45 degrees between horizontal and vertical. While he's in the act of lying down mindfully, he became enlightened. So, I mean, that has nothing to do with the question, but it reminded me of that. Just sort of meditation or spiritual advancement in other than the standard sitting or walking. Some monks, I assume, have become enlightened through standing. Like, there is a story in the commentaries about a monk who is meditating on bones. There's the 32 parts of the body, and if one of the 32 parts, which includes ati or bones, it really resonates with you. You can just specialize on that. So a monk was just seeing everyone as bones. It's just seeing skeletons. I think it was like Ajahn Mun or Ajahn Mahabua went through a stage also where they were meditating on bones so much they were just seeing walking skeletons. They were just seeing people as bones. But there's this young woman came up to him, and she's sort of like flirting with him or just being sort of coarse and vulgar with this monk. And she's laughing, and when she opens her mouth and is laughing, he sees her teeth, sees those as bones, and it somehow just caused this click where he became enlightened. Just seeing this laughing woman's teeth as bones. But yeah, I think I answered that question. I'll just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidana's question. Sometimes I'm answering questions that nobody asked, but I guess that's okay too, because it's my show. I can answer anything I want to. So Siovak and Sipad Zidana says, if nuns weren't allowed to sit cross-legged, how did they do sitting meditation? Well, that's a sensible question. And the way they were supposed to sit is the way well-mannered, demure Burmese ladies are supposed to sit. You don't sit cross-legged. That's considered to be unladylike in Burma. They sit with both feet kind of tucked into one side. So it's not good for posture, because when you've got both feet tucked to one side, as I'm indicating even now, you're kind of leaning to one side, and then you have to kind of compensate. And so it's not really ideal for meditation, but that is how bhikkhunis are supposed to sit in meditation. And I doubt that there's very many of these new bhikkhunis that actually do that, because they're not really interested in following the rules strictly, despite insisting on being recognized as fully ordained. But we don't need to get into that. So I'll just move on to the next question, also by Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And he says, what is samasati actually supposed to mean? I hear that it technically means memory, and that someone who is born satiman means they remember their past life. Vipassana practitioners claim it is bare awareness on the objects of the four foundations of mindfulness. And in some places, I've seen sati be used synonymously with heedfulness. With all these conflicting definitions, it's hard to know what samasati is supposed to actually mean. Well, the non-philosophical meaning of the sati in Pali is memory, but it doesn't mean, usually doesn't mean memory in Buddhist philosophy, unless it's like anusati or like recollection of like the qualities of the Buddha or something. That could be a kind of memory, or remembering what you've been told about the qualities of the Buddha anyway. But if you read the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, it defines the Noble Eightfold Path. Each step of the Noble Eightfold Path is defined in an orthodox and authoritative manner. So if you look up Samasati, and I didn't do this, but I'm pretty sure my memory serves me correctly, that it goes over the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 satipatthanas. So that would be right mindfulness in Theravada Buddhism would be the four satipatthanas, the 4 foundation of mindfulness, which is mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of dhammas. And that mindfulness of dhammas is controversial. It's controversial to this day. Sometimes it's interpreted as mindfulness of mental states, or it can also be mindfulness of just certain philosophical points. But you can work that out for yourself. But if you want to know the standard orthodox interpretation of Samasati, I'd look it up in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is in the Digha Nikaya. And I'm pretty sure they're just going to give the standard explanation of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So we'll just move on to Sio Vaksha and Sipat Zidana's next question. And that is, it is said that in the first council, the Venerable Ananda recited the suttas from memory, and the Venerable Upali recited the Vinaya in the presence of 500 arahants. However, you have said you don't think much of the suttas or Vinaya date back to the Buddha himself. So what do you think actually happened during the historical first council? I think what probably happened was the monks got together after the Buddha passed away, and they had to set up certain protocols. Like, when the Buddha was alive, he would just say, Ehi Bhikkhu, come monk, and that would be good enough. I mean, the person would be considered ordained as a monk. But now that the Buddha wasn't alive anymore, they had to set up protocols for like ordination procedure and just ecclesiastical matters. And I would guess that the Patimokkha rules, the core 227 rule, no, not the 227, there's like 152. All of the Patimokkha except for the Sakya rules would be probably laid down at the first council. Different schools of Buddhism had different Sakya rules. There's a lot of variation in the last section of rules that are very minor rules. They're the most minor rules. But with regard to the rules before that, there's very close similarity. So it may be that there was some suttas also added, not all of them, but yeah, it's hard to say. I can't really say with regard to the sutta part, but I think that the first council was mainly with regard to monastic discipline and just setting out like protocols, rules for ordination and so forth. And in some places, the first council is referred to as the Vinaya Samgiti, which is the convocation on monastic discipline. And you just read the origin story of how the first council arose. It was after the Buddha passed away into Parinibbana, after he disappeared from samsara. Most of the monks, well, the enlightened monks, they were stoic, they were serene. The unenlightened monks were mostly very sad, and even Ananda was pretty messed. He was there's one scene where he's just leaning against a pillar crying. But there's one old monk who was ordained when he was old, who's like, hey, why all the long faces? Now we don't have Venerable Gautama saying, do this, don't do that all the time. We can do what we want. And Mahakassapa, who was the senior monk in the Sangha at the time, heard that, and he was kind of alarmed at this. And he had the idea, we're going to have to do something about this. And so even the origin of the first council, even according to Orthodox tradition, if you read between the lines, it was to set up monastic discipline. And if you read really old texts like the Atthakavagga, the Buddha actually warns against clinging to sets of rules and so forth. But I mean, you have to have rules if the organization isn't just going to disintegrate over time. Once the charismatic enlightened founder is gone, things just kind of dissipate unless you have some kind of structure and order to keep things in place. And I think that was what the main purpose of the first council was just getting this order for the Sangha established to keep things going in a relatively stable manner. And there may have been some philosophical points added also, but I think the philosophical stuff was already, it was sort of taken care of in a sort of a different venue. But I don't know for sure. It's really hard to say. But it is pretty clear just from the texts that the main purpose of the first council was monastic discipline. And that would include probably at the very least, as I say, just ordination procedures and so forth, and also the core of the Patimokkha rules, all except for the Sakya rules, which are just sort of like good manners. You know, it's like, what's the word? There's this word I'm trying to think of. Etiquette. They're like rules of etiquette, like don't talk with your mouth full of food, that kind of thing. So I guess I answered that one as well as I'm able, because, I mean, to some degree, we just can't know. Because Buddhist chronicles, ancient Indian chronicles in general, are not entirely reliable. So I'll just move on to Sio Vaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, in the suttas, it says that doing metta meditation will lead to the following, quote, one sleeps easily, wakes easily, dreams no evil dreams. One is dear to human beings, dear to non-human beings. The devas protect one. Neither fire, poison, nor weapons can touch one. One's mind gains concentration quickly. One's complexion is bright. One dies unconfused and, if penetrating no higher, is headed for the Brahma worlds, unquote. Do you think this is true? Because if it is true, it is way more overpowered compared to other meditation techniques. If you do metta meditation correctly and you've got genuine metta, I mean, you're not just going through may all beings be well, may all beings be happy, just reciting it like you're reading from a phone book. If it's like sincere, you're actually generating this beaming metta in all directions. You know, you're beaming thoughts of brotherly love in all directions, then yeah, at least you're going to be taking some major steps in the directions of these benefits that Sio Vaksh and Sipad Zidana has quoted here. You're more likely to sleep easily, you're more likely to wake easily, you're less likely to have nightmares, more likely to be dear to human beings and dear to non-human beings. I mean, if you're just beaming love, you know, animals are going to like you more, people are going to like you more. This neither fire, poison, or weapons can touch you. I don't think that means that you're bulletproof or that, you know, someone's going to be shooting at you and always missing or something, but you're just less likely to have bad things happen to you because you're going to have better karma. So I think, you know, I mean, if you perfected just brotherly love towards all beings in the universe, yeah, I think you'd have really good karma. And I mean, still, you're going to have past karma that's going to come up. But I think you'd be taking some major steps in this direction, even if it's not 100% literally true. So, yeah, I mean, love is pretty powerful. So I'll just move on to the next question here. Also by Sio Vaksh and Sipad Zidana. You have said a monk doesn't want to make positive karma either. However, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha says to Ananda that he has made a lot of merit and that he will quickly achieve the goal. Doesn't that imply merit helps even a monk reach the goal? Well, it helps you to move in that direction. I mean, the merit isn't going to get you enlightened. I mean, that's the main point. That no action is going to get you enlightened, because if your enlightenment is the result of action, it's going to be conditioned and impermanent, and it's not going to be genuine enlightenment. So it's a paradoxical state, and it may be meaningless within a samsaric context in that regard. If I remember correctly, there's somebody asks me about this a little later. So, I mean, you can, how do I explain this? I mean, I've explained this before. It's like, sort of like Krishnamurti says, you know, you can open the window, but you can't make the breeze blow in. I mean, you can get as ready as possible for it to happen, but you can't make it happen. So you get yourself clear, you get yourself wise, you kind of clean up your karma so that shit isn't happening and distracting you and just disturbing your meditation all the time, and you just get your mind as clear and as peaceful as possible, and then it increases the odds of enlightenment, but there is no guarantee whatsoever. But the Buddha is saying to Ananda that he will quickly achieve the goal. He could have just been prophesying rather than going with the made a lot of merit. See, he has made a lot of merit, and that he will quickly achieve the goal. The merit, it kind of gets you ready to achieve the goal, but again, you do not become enlightened as the result of merit or as the result of any action, which is paradoxical. So I think I'll just move on to Siyovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, what do you think of the psychic powers in the suttas, like mind reading, levitating, teleportation, being at many places at once, traveling to other dimensions, etc.? I know you believe in the paranormal, but these are deliberate uses of psychic powers on their own. Yeah, most of the psychic powers on the standard list of psychic powers I can accept, like walking on water. Jesus didn't have a monopoly on that. It was mentioned long before Jesus was born as something that is the result of, intensive spiritual practice, especially if you cultivate jhana. Yeah, levitation, flying through the air, teleportation, just disappearing in one place, reappearing in another place, which is apparently how the devas that's just their standard mode of traveling. They just disappear in one place and reappear somewhere else. Being in many places at once, yeah. A lot of these, Neem Karoli Baba had a reputation for doing a lot of these, especially the teleportation and the being in many places at once. And also he did some of it's called the Annapurna in Hinduism in India, which is like the miracle of the loaves and the fishes in the Bible, where you just take a small amount of food and you just divide it up and just keep giving it out, and just as though there is an endless supply of it. The one psychic power, and I mentioned this in a relatively recent Q&A, that it takes some difficulty in swallowing it, is that you're able to reach out and touch and stroke the sun and moon. And I think the commentaries kind of try and patch that up a bit by saying that you create like a replica of the sun and moon or something, and then but yeah, that was a tough one, reaching out and stroking and caressing the sun and moon. But again, with regard to psychic powers, that he says a deliberate use of psychic powers, the more advanced you get, the less deliberate your behavior becomes. You just become more spontaneous, and the psychic powers can just flow out of you. Like if you're fully enlightened, then really, in a way, nothing is deliberate, because you're no longer creating karma. You no longer have like regular human volition, and so it's just like the correct action is just elicited from you spontaneously, and that may include weird like coincidences, which include miracles. So with regard to this question, it's kind of a two-part question for me. Yeah, I can accept that the psychic powers on the standard list are all possible, except maybe for the reaching out and stroking the sun and moon. I mean, the sun would be pretty hot. I guess you could stroke it at night, but that was a joke. I made a joke just now. Let's see. And then the deliberate use of psychic powers. Deliberate use of psychic powers, I mean, that'll almost be like magic, like witchcraft or something. But the more spiritual it is, the more it's just like miracles just spontaneously happen around a spiritually advanced person. So I think I'll just move on to the Siyovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question. And we're already over an hour. This is supposed to be like a short one, because this is less than 2 weeks worth of questions here. But I digress. His next question. Also, there is a question. Oh, wait. Also, there is mention in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that mastering the Iddhipadas can let one live for the length of the entire universe, the kappa. But the Venerable Buddhaghosa said that when the Buddha said this, he meant only 100 years old, as Maitreya Buddha still had to come. But given that the idea of the Maitreya Buddha was a later addition, do you think that Buddha could have actually lived for the length of the whole universe with his powers? In the Sarvastivada tradition, they claimed Venerable Mahakassapa mastered the Iddhipada and is waiting for the Maitreya Buddha in a cave. So this universe-length lifespan seems to be taken more seriously by other traditions. Yeah, kappa doesn't necessarily mean like an entire lifespan of this cosmos. So yeah, it might be that Buddhaghosa in the commentaries is right that it meant like the full lifespan of a human instead of dying when he was, I think, 85. Gosh. But I don't think the Buddha could have actually lived for the length of the whole universe, because I mean the Earth is going to be absorbed into a nova in a few billion years. I don't know what the Buddha would be doing, if he lived longer than this Earth. Maybe, and he could get, devas would come scoop him up or something. But yeah, I've read about, um, like, if you've read Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahamsa Yogananda, he talks about essentially immortal swamis living in the Himalayas. But I mean, if you're in a human body, I mean, the human body is just kind of like planned obsolescence. I mean, old age and death are just part of the whole system. And yeah, the Buddha was getting old. I mean, he wasn't still young when he was, before he died, when he was in his early 80s. He was getting old. So yeah, this could also be um, just kind of mythology that got added to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And maybe just a teensy bit of evidence that it could be just sort of some kind of Indian mythology is that at the first council, Ananda got attacked essentially by seemingly rather spiteful, fully enlightened beings at the first council, because the Buddha was hinting that if Ananda just spoke up and urged him to stay alive, he would have stayed alive longer. And Ananda was slow on the uptake and didn't take the hint. And so then he's getting condemned and blamed by the 500 fully enlightened beings, or the 499. I think 500 that that the Buddha, or that Ananda didn't request the Buddha to live longer. And I don't know, just the whole story just seems more like it seems more like mythology than actual objective history. But who knows? Again, with regard to a lot of this stuff, I mean, stuff that was written literally more than 2,000 years ago. It's really hard to say exactly what the story is. I mean, stuff that happened not so long ago. I mean, with the media as it is now, you can't be sure what happened last year or yesterday. And I don't think that the ancient Indian chronicles were a whole lot more reliable than the mass media today. So yeah, it's just open to debate what the exact meaning of the Buddha saying that he could live for an entire kappa, um, and whether he even really said it or not, because it does seem kind of fishy to me. So I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana's next and last question. You said Nibbana might not mean anything in samsara, but doesn't it mean the end of suffering? Yeah, I mean, you can interpret it that way, but you can't really comprehend it. I mean, how it can happen, how it could possibly even happen, as I've already mentioned, is paradoxical. It just doesn't really fit, because it's like off the scale. And so if you're trying to understand it within the scale, it's like within the terms of samsara, that's the only way you can understand anything is in a samsaric way, because you're using samsaric understanding, you're using like cogitation, you're using brain function or intellect or even intuition or something, and it's all samsaric, and so you can't really understand samsara. It's like a paradox. It doesn't make sense. Um, so I mean, you can give it an easy definition like the end of suffering or the end of delusion, or I mean, there's different ways of going about describing it, or even you want to go a slightly unorthodox route. You could say it's infinite consciousness, infinite formless consciousness that's luminous all round, unmanifest, but it's all just sort of makeshifts as a way to try to understand what really ultimately cannot be understood. And so any attempt at describing what can't be understood is definitely going to be lacking in some respect. So, I mean, you can give it some kind of meaning that is satisfactory to most people, but still they're not going to understand what it is. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Weird Flex. And Weird Flex says, you and I are about the same height, Panyo. I was wondering if you had any advice for us tall guys that struggle to maintain a proper meditative posture. I especially seem to struggle with pain in the ankles, but any tips you might have would be well and truly appreciated. I really didn't know that tall guys have any kind of disadvantage in sitting in like full lotus or proper meditative posture. I thought it might even be easier. Because I mean, someone with short legs would have more difficulty getting into the full lotus than someone with longer legs that you've got more to work with, or something. It could just be like a hereditary thing. Like my father could not squat down on his own heels. He couldn't like all the way squat down. He was not very flexible in his legs, and I inherited a little bit of that. Although I eventually got to the point where I could sit in the full lotus for a full hour, and it might start hurting a bit towards the end. I gave this story a long time ago about some old guy I met in San Francisco. He came to a talk that I gave, and he could just flop into the full lotus. I mean, he didn't have to use his hands. It's like he could just sit down and his legs would just go like this. And he's just sort of grinning at everybody saying, it only hurts for the first 5 years. So it could just, I don't think the tallness itself is really an issue. It may just be you don't have very flexible legs. And you can look up articles, probably on the internet, on how to gradually stretch yourself so you can sit into the full lotus without pain. I'm pretty sure there used to be like yoga magazines that would have articles on this stuff, and I'm almost positive you could find that sort of thing on the internet, what kind of stretches to do and so forth, so that you can sit in full lotus posture without much pain. But I'm not even sure if you're even referring to full lotus here. It could just be even the easy position where you've got both feet kind of flat on the floor, one in front of the other, one ankle in front of the other. That might be hard for you also. Sitting on a rolled up towel, like one of those big zafus like they use in Zen, one of those big pillows, that was always too much for me. But you just take a regular towel and just roll it up so you've got something that's like this wide and maybe this big around, and you just prop it up underneath like the back of your behind, and it helps to keep your back straight. That's like one of the most important things, is to keep your back straight. That's probably more important than sitting in a full lotus position, full lotus posture, the Padmasana. So, yeah, I mean, I just kind of toughed it out, I guess. I just kept doing it, and it hurt. And it may be that I'm paying for it a little bit now. It's like I do have kind of wonky joints in my knees and my hips to some degree now, just from just forcing myself to sit in a full lotus. I was so inflexible in my lower body that I had this ambition when I was a young monk. I wanted to be able to sit in the full lotus for 4 hours straight and then sleep in that posture. I'd be doing the sitting Dhutanga at the highest level, and I never got close. I think the longest I ever sat in the full lotus without just searing agony was maybe a little over 2 hours. That was the best I could do. But with regard to this, yeah, I would advise you to look up some yoga articles, or probably even they got YouTube videos on this kind of stuff. How to stretch so that you can sit in the full lotus comfortably, because the full lotus is the best meditative posture. I'm not exactly sure why. I've got theories. One is it just helps you to sit straight upright more easily. And just being straight upright just naturally makes you more alert. If you're in a sleepy posture, you're more likely to feel sleepy. If you're in an alert posture, which is like straight up and down, you're more likely to be alert, which again is one reason why meditating while lying down doesn't work so good. But also, I think maybe like yogis, the yoga people might have theories of, it helps the kundalini energy or something. I think also just having your legs folded up like this might reduce blood flow to your legs, which would increase blood flow to the upper body, including your brain, thereby making you more alert or something. But yeah, I just toughed it, and maybe that was not the best approach to take. So I would look up some yoga stretches on how to sit in a good meditative posture more comfortably. That would be my advice. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Mary, spelled Merry. And Mary says, does your future wife listen to these Q&As, and does she comment on some of these questions? Yeah, she watches each Q&A. And I mean, to some degree, she's just trying to help the algorithm, I think. And yeah, I mean, usually she's listening. Sometimes it might just be background noise while she's multitasking or something. And she does ask a few of the questions, not very many. She didn't ask any this time. But yeah, she occasionally asks a question too. So yeah, that's the answer to that question, is yeah. And then Mary's next question is, while I am at it, may I ask, is your future wife a Theravada Buddhist? And not really. In the West, it's really, I mean, most people in the West tend to be eclectic, or especially if you're kind of moving away from a traditional Christian like approach to spirituality. Um, yeah, she goes to different sources. She watches old Ram Dass videos. She likes Manly P. Hall, listens to his philosophical kind of stuff, watches Theosophists. Um, so yeah, she's interested in a lot of things. So I mean, even I am not like 100% Orthodox Theravada Buddhist. It's like my mind isn't narrow enough to just fit into that category. Some Mahayana I think is good. Nagarjuna I like. Um, I mean, some Hinduism. I read the Tao Te Ching sometimes. So yeah, even I am not, like, strictly speaking, like a really good Theravada Buddhist. So and she's probably a little more on the away from orthodoxy than I am, but she is interested. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Here is a somewhat childish question. Is Mara aware of our talking or thinking about him, her, it? Well, whether Mara even exists or not is, I've expressed some doubt on this issue on probably like 10 Q&As ago or 20 Q&As ago. I really don't think we need a cosmic bad guy to lure us into temptation. I mean, I'm sure that there are some freelance cosmic bad guys out there that just like fucking with people, but even they can't do anything to you that it isn't your karma to have happen. And Mara, just like the position of cosmic bad guy, it's sort of like, the devil in Christianity. There are differences between Mara and the Christian devil, but they do both have the sort of like the position of, being the tempter, the bad guy, the person who's trying to keep people from reaching the spiritual goal. And Mara, I mean, he's not trying to keep people out of heaven so much as he's just trying to keep people from getting enlightened and leaving the whole system, because in a way he's like Lord of Samsara. There's one metaphor or simile, no, I think it's a metaphor of, you've got Mahabrahma in the palm of Mara's hand. I don't remember where I read that, but it's in there somewhere, which is symbolic of, even the highest heaven realms are all within Mara's realm of samsara. He's like the god of samsara. And if he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because going to heaven, heaven is still in samsara. It's a more comfortable level of it than here or hell, but still, it's all part of the system. And with regard to, is he aware? Assuming that Mara exists, probably he doesn't give a damn if we're talking about him or not. Maybe if he's just it's a slow news day, he's just, kind of lounging up there in the heaven realm of the gods who delight in the creations of others. His daughters aren't pestering him. He might just take a glance down at the earth, or, if he's not trying to tempt some yogi into having lustful thoughts or something, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly, and the wind is blowing hard right now. Let's see. Yeah, it might be like asking if Santa Claus is aware of whether we're good or bad when we're kids. Yeah. Yeah, that is, it's not really a childish question, but it's kind of a difficult question, because personally, I just don't think that there's, I'm sure that there are malevolent beings out there that are like above the human level, even though they're bad. They're more powerful than us. They might be in a different realm that can come into this realm and mess with us sometimes. Maybe they just hate certain types of beings, or hate certain ideas, and I don't know. But just to have like one person whose job is to be Mara, that, it seems kind of pushing it to me. It's more mythological, I think, than this empirical. And I'm whether they know that when we're thinking about them. Yeah, Maras is sometimes in the plural, even the Pali text. So there's more than one of these kind of devils, or whatever you want to call them, demons. Although Mara technically is a deva, he's a god. Just he's sort of a, never mind. Yeah, it's really a tough question, because first of all, I'm not even sure that Mara even exists. And so if you interpret that as just sort of powerful, malevolent beings out there, are they aware of us talking or thinking about them? I think probably most of them just don't give a damn what we think, unless they're trying to influence us in some way, and then they're already attending to us. But I don't think, if they're not attending to us, I don't think they care, or, yeah, that's sort of my best answer. It's sort of a semi-coherent answer, but that's how it came out of my mouth. And so finally, and really finally here, the last question of this Q&A, also by Rui. And this is kind of an interesting one. Do you think AI is pure materiality, or rupa? It seems to deal with meaning with a certain ease, even flair, but it is just a non-sentient arrangement of soft and hardware. Well, materialists can say the same thing about a brain. It's like AI is in a computer, and human consciousness, according to the materialists, is just in a brain. So it's just an arrangement of software and hardware, except the hardware is more wetware. It's just this gooey gray meat up there with lots of nerves in it. So, if human consciousness from a material level is just material, but it's just like a side effect of chemical reactions, electrochemical reactions in the gray blob of meat. You could look at AI in a computer as similar. And if computers ever become as complex as a human brain, why couldn't consciousness arise in a computer? Already they can mimic consciousness. They have a certain intelligence, which could be just very rudimentary consciousness. Because my theory is that the entire universe is conscious. So there's consciousness even in a computer chip, even if the computer chip is empty. I mean, there's been nothing downloaded into it or anything. You know, a brick has this rudimentary, extremely elemental kind of consciousness to it. I mean, in my opinion, at least it's the working hypothesis that I'm working with. So I don't see any reason why consciousness would have to arise only in a brain. I mean, what is it about a brain that has this monopoly on consciousness arising in it? You'd think, I mean, to me, it would seem it's just the complexity of it, but potentially computers could become even more complex than brains. So why wouldn't it, like an extremely complex supercomputer, have consciousness and start becoming like self-aware? Because I think, you know, even a hydrogen atom has like this tiny elemental glimmer of consciousness anyway. So yeah, that's my answer. I'm sticking to it. So that was it, and I may have to just keep doing Q&As at less than 2 weeks, just to get down to below 3 hours like last time. I think I had another 3 hour one like a couple months ago. So if you have any questions you think I can answer, something about Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, Eastern philosophy in general, you know, Burma, my own personal experiences as a monk in Burma, my own personal experiences lately, I'm pretty good. I got a pretty good idea of what my own personal experiences were, so I can answer those kind of questions fairly easily. Just meditation, that kind of stuff. If you have any kind of questions that you think I might be able to answer, feel free to ask in the comments below. And subscribe, please, if you haven't already. And look at my URL links in the comments below, or in the description thingy above the comments. And be happy.